Hi everyone, I'm Phil Liggett, and for the next 90 minutes sit back and enjoy the Royals of Summer and the Tour de France 1991. It was a race with a big difference this year. In fact, only 10 big mountain passes to climb, and they all began at Pau, through the Pyrenees for 2 days and across the bottom of France, heading up towards the Alps and of course the famous climb of Alpe d'Huez. The 22 teams all selected by the World Points ranking systems, making up 198 riders, all hoping they would reach Paris. The distance, 3,900 kilometres, the days, 22. It all began in Lyon. Lyon, of course, a city that was on the very first Tour de France route back in 1903. And it went on, then from Lyon, it stayed for one circuit of 114.5 kilometres. The second part of a long day, 36.5 kilometres, a team time trial at nearby Bron. And then the race finally left Lyon, heading up towards Dijon, 210 kilometres there. On towards the Champagne capital at Reims, or Reims as we like to say, and then on from Reims to Valenciennes. The race was at the moment heading towards the northern Belgian borders, and then from there it headed across the parts of Normandy and Brittany, through Le Havre, heading down to Argentan. The first big time trial was there after the 7th stage. The time trial, just 73 kilometres, but what a ride. From Alençon on towards Rennes, the capital of Brittany if you're a cyclist, because it really is a hotbed of the sport. Out to the coast to Quimper, 207 kilometres, and then heading south towards the mountains to Saint-Herblain. Once you get to Saint-Herblain, there was a long plane trip taking the riders down to the Pyrenees and the gateway at the city of Pau, into Spain to Jaca, and then out of Spain to Val-Thorens. This was the stage everyone feared. Across the bottom of the valleys of France, where the little hills are steep and short, through Albi, where the weather is certain to be hot and sticky, onto Alès, and then the riders begin to head towards the Alps themselves, towards Gap, which is the gateway to the Alps this year, and then to Alpe d'Huez itself, which to every cyclist is a shrine. Around the borders of Switzerland and Italy, the race stays in the Alps, from Bourg d'Oisans to Morzine. Then from Morzine, heading out to easier countryside, to Aix-les-Bains and the beautiful lake that is there. The terrain now gets a little bit easier as the riders go back into wine country for a 57-kilometre penultimate day's time trial from Lugny to Mâcon, and then the last stage itself, the 22nd and final stage, taking the survivors to the Eiffel Tower in Paris. The Tour de France, a prize list of $1.7 million, was about to begin. The opening time trial, 5.4 kilometres, based in the centre of Lyon and the Parc de la Tête d'Or. Greg LeMond starting the Tour de France in yellow in defence of a championship he's won on 3 previous occasions. And Greg LeMond, who hadn't won a race all year, was bang on top of form yet again. The Tour de France, he loves it, and he comes home at the time with a time that was only to be 3 seconds slower than the fastest time of the day. Erik Breukink of Holland, expected to be the main challenger to Greg LeMond, he put in the expected time trial performance, and it was to beat LeMond by a single second. But the man who beat both of them was Thierry Marey, the French prologue specialist. He's twice before won the prologue in the Tour de France, and this was to be his 3 times win. Thierry Marey for the Castorama team came home with the best time, just 6 minutes 11 seconds, beating Breukink by 2 seconds. And with it, the first yellow jersey was going to a Frenchman. The French were not expected to do well in this Tour de France, but they'd made the perfect start. Lyon was going a long way to lose its image as an industrial city and one with too much traffic. And on the first stage of the Tour de France, it was 114.5 kilometres, based on the Parc de la Tête d'Or. It came back to the same start point, and Thierry Marey was again the Frenchman in the lead after a prologue. He'd done it twice before, remember. He was defending, of course, just a 2-second lead over Erik Breukink and a 3-second lead over Greg LeMond. But the whole field was only separated by a total of 53 seconds. Everybody was aware of this, and everybody said this opening stage was a difficult one. And sure enough, there was a surprise. Remember a year ago when 4 riders broke clear? Well, there were more this time. There were in fact 11 of them, and one of them was Greg LeMond, making no mistakes this time. He was joined by the rider in green, Erik Breukink, and also Sean Kelly. The stars of the Tour de France appeared to be making a big mistake again on the opening stage. And watch the sprint here of Jamaluddin Abdu-Japarov winning a hotspot sprint. He was to become the demon sprinter of the Tour de France this year. Greg LeMond knew what he had done. He'd started a move, all because Ralph Jarman, the former champion of Switzerland, riding his first Tour de France, had attacked very early on. They picked up Jarman, and between them they built a gap of over 2 minutes over the rest of the Tour de France. Had the big names in the Tour, with the exception of Breukink and Le Monde, made a mistake this time as well. In the sprint for the line, the world champion Rudy Dahlmans was leading out for the win. He too hadn't had a great year since winning the world title in Japan a year ago, and he wasn't about to win this stage either. The speedy legs of the Tashkent flyer Abdu Japarov came to the front. Sean Kelly, trying to win the stage on the right for the first time since 1982, was pipped to the line. In third place was Greg LeMond. Greg LeMond really was taking this Tour de France to heart already. The main field came in 1 minute and 44 seconds behind, and they were led home by Jean-Paul Van Poppel, the sprinter who was back to form. But what a time gap at the end of the very first morning's road race. Greg LeMond was back in the yellow jersey, the colour of the Tour de France he loves so much. With a break of only some 3 hours, the riders moved to the outskirts of Lyon to Bronn for the 36.5 kilometres team time trial. And it was here where the world champion Rudy Dahlmans was leading the Panasonic team to what was to be the third best time of the day. Controversy was already rife in the Tour de France because at the start line, in fact, Stephen Roche had failed to arrive in time with his team. The team had gone without him. Roche rode the course alone and was later eliminated from the Tour de France. The 1987 winner was out after virtually the opening weekend was only just about over. The Panasonics arrived with the best time at that moment, but not too far further along the road was the Castorama team, led by Laurent Fignon, Luc Leblanc, and of course the man who'd lost his yellow jersey in the morning, Thierry Marie. They would have set a better time than Panasonic's, but it wasn't going to be good enough to give them back the yellow jersey. And it was Thierry Marie who brought the Castorama team home. But not too far further back along the course, Ariostia were in all sorts of trouble. A mistake by one of the riders, and a number of them fell on the final bend. One of them was Rolf Sørensen, 6th in the morning's road race, and hoping to be the leader of the Tour de France by the end of this time trial. The team finished without him. Sørensen had to limp home with his handlebars twisted, but he did take the leader's yellow jersey by just 10 seconds away from Greg LeMond, a Danish leader of the Tour de France, and that doesn't happen too often. The very next day was stage 3, the riders riding 210.5 kilometres from Villeurbanne, which is just outside of Lyon, to Dijon, the mustard capital of France. These flat stages concern many of the riders, but they should have been a feast for the sprinters. One sprinter is Etienne de Wilde. He didn't wait for the finish though. A kilometre from the line he leapt clear of the field, and they never caught him again till the finish. On to stage 4, and away from the mustard capital we headed up to Reims, the capital of the Champagne countryside. A long way, 286 kilometres, and again the sprinters were hoping to have their day. On the line, Jamoluddin Abdu Japarov, a name to be noted. He never won a race last year. He was having a great season this time though. Maurizio Fondries was soon leading the attack again next day. This time we were heading away from Reims up to Valenciennes. All of the time now the race was moving up towards the borders of Belgium. The wind was blowing and the weather was surprisingly warm. The big danger though is the many roundabouts now being built in France. The tight roads, the many twists, and the result, a lot of crashes. There was great concern here, the organisation saying they no longer feel that they can consider some of the city centres for finishes because they are simply becoming too dangerous with the street signage. A number of riders were down, but the one rider that unfortunately all of the cameras missed was the crash of the yellow jersey Rolf Sørensen. He fell on a very sharp bend. He went down a ditch, he climbed back, he took the bike of a teammate, Bruno Kenglialta, and when he finished, they all hadn't realised at first that in fact Sørensen had fallen at all. He'd finished the stage with a broken collarbone. The leader of the Tour de France had finished, but he was not going to start again next day. The field split up on the road into Valenciennes, and it was the ideal opportunity for the Dutchman Jelle Nijdam to take the stage. He's a specialist in presenting the surprise in the final kilometre, and he did just that as the race came up towards the line. Jelle Nijdam slipped away, threw his arms in the air, but this was the story of the day. The sad sight of Rolf Sørensen of Denmark out of the Tour de France. And the very next morning the new leader was Greg LeMond. But in true Tour tradition, Greg LeMond refused to pull on the leader's yellow jersey. As far as Greg was concerned, the vacancy was now open.
Je crois que c'est pas un bon geste si je mets le maillot. C'est pas comme ça, je veux prendre le maillot et je préfère comme ça.
Officially, Greg LeMond was only in second place in the Tour de France, 9 seconds behind Rolf Sørensen, who was no longer, of course, with the Tour de France. LeMond was now racing to regain the yellow jersey. But so too was Thierry Marie. With the second longest successful escape in the history of the Tour de France, over 230 kilometres, Marie was back in yellow at Le Havre. It was even nicer. He wasn't too far from where he actually lived. The next day, with the Castorama team all around him, protecting him, Thierry Marie surprisingly back in yellow. Nobody really expected that. The race went on its crashing way towards the finishing line at Argentan. But in a sprint of 185 riders, Jean-Paul Van Poppel was the winner of the stage. The sprinter, it seemed, was also back on form. The yellow jersey, though, remained now on the shoulders of Thierry Marie. But because of that long breakaway of 235 kilometres, Marie was far too tired in the first big time trial of the Tour de France, the 73 kilometres from Argentan down to Alençon, to defend his overall lead. At the start of the time trial, he led the Tour de France by 59 seconds ahead of Jamaluddin Abdu-Japarov. But by the end of the time trial, he was going to be out of the running. Number 11 was Claudio Chiappucci, the rider who couldn't ride a time trial 1 year ago when finishing second to Greg LeMond in the Tour de France. My, how much he's improved now. Chiappucci came home in the end for 19th place, but he conceded more than 4 minutes to the rider who was eventually to win the time trial. Laurent Fignon, it seems, really was coming back towards good form. He was fighting all of the way. So too was Raoul Alcala, who won the first time trial in the Tour de France a year ago. And he caught and passed here Olaf Ludwig, the rider who won the Green Points jersey just 1 year ago. But all of the riders to beat were coming at the end of the field. The champion of Italy, Gianni Bugno, the rider everybody said would be the next man to win the Tour de France. Eric Breukink, 2 top time trial wins last year in the Tour de France and leading all the way in this one until the last 10 kilometres, and then he hit the wall. Jean-Francois Bernard, a new team for him this year, riding for the Banesto team to help Miguel Indurain and Pedro Delgado. And it seemed too that Jean-Francois Bernard had refound his old self. He produced the third fastest time of the day. And what about the American, Greg LeMond, who is further back on the course? Greg LeMond now was hoping to again become the leader of the Tour de France. He is producing time checks all the way along that were threatening to be just that, the best times of the day. The crowds were now enormous. This is the hotbed of cycling in France, and the Bretons just love to be out. Brittany and Normandy are where all the top bike riders always seem to come from. Greg LeMond was once again his old self, riding a time trial just like he did a couple of years ago when he won the race on the Champs-Élysées. Roger Leger knew his man was on a good ride, and LeMond was, as they say, burying himself. He was heading towards the finish with the best time of the day, but it wasn't to be the best time of the day when the last man to finish came home. The legs of the rider everybody was beginning to talk about, Miguel Indurain, the handsome Spaniard. Miguel Indurain was setting the best time all the way along the course. Once Eric Breukink blew up, Miguel Indurain was taking charge, and by the finish he'd done the best time, 1 hour 35 minutes and 44 seconds. 8 seconds better than LeMond, but LeMond was in yellow by 1 minute and 13 seconds. The race continued its rather flat route as it went away from Argentan and Alençon and headed out towards Rennes. Stage 9, 161 kilometres, carried the riders from Alençon to Rennes. Again, the riders were looking for escapes. They were looking for a big gap that might well close the gap of that very first day escape that had built a big bridge between Greg LeMond and Eric Breukink. The peloton now were 1 minute 45 seconds behind, but in this lead group there really weren't too many riders that would worry Greg LeMond. Up towards the finishing line, and Brazil don't win too many stages in any race in the world, and never before in the Tour de France. Mauro Ribeiro, riding for the RMO team, took his chance and won his stage. Certainly the happiest moment in the life of the Brazilian Mauro Ribeiro. The next day, rumour was rife as the riders began to ride away towards Quimper, 207 kilometres. The PDM team were in all kinds of trouble. Not starting the stage, Nico Verhoeven and Uwe Raab, and soon after the stage started, the majority of the riders were riding behind the race. Martin Early of Ireland was about to retire. Eric Breukink was rumoured to have a fever, so too Sean Kelly. The riders were all saying they had a form of food poisoning. Despite this trouble at the back, there was a breakaway of 4 going clear. Phil Anderson from Motorola, the Australian, Nico Emmons, Brian Home and Michel Dernice from the Wyman squad sitting at the back here. He was the winner of the Tour of Britain 1 year ago. Anderson was searching for his first ever stage win since 1982, and he certainly was having a great season, arguably indeed his best ever season since turning professional. The breakaway built time as they headed down towards the finish at Quimper. Although as we watched Phil Anderson sprint for victory, I have to say everybody was talking about the PDM team. What on earth had gone wrong with them? Anderson made the sprint a formality. Almost 10 years on, he's again a stage winner in the Tour de France, but it wasn't going to affect the overall situation. And they only just survived as well by a handful of seconds. After almost 5.5 hours of racing, the main field almost had them. Happy days for Phil Anderson, but the same could not be said for the PDM team. The rumour was, in fact, as Volta arrived, eliminated from the race, but he was determined to continue to the finish. The former East German world champion did arrive, but was eliminated. Martin Early got back on his bike just to say hi to the journalists and say he had a fever in excess of 40 degrees. Martin Early climbed out the sag wagon to ride away to his hotel. It was goodbye to the PDM team. Nobody quite knew what was wrong, but it was later said to be problems with intravenous injection of liquid food. 1,900 kilometres had now been completed in the Tour de France and 11 stages had been covered. The riders now faced a long plane transfer down to the gateway to the Pyrenees. This was the overall situation, and remembering that the PDM team had riders in 3rd, 6th and 9th places, they were no longer in the race. Greg LeMond was leading the Tour de France by 51 seconds from Jamaleddine Abdou-Japarov. In 3rd place was the Spanish rider Miguel Indurain, 4th Jean-François Bernard and 5th Gianni Bugno. Of the other fancied names, Luc Leblanc was in 6th place but 4 minutes plus back. Pedro Delgado was 8th, Laurent Fignon 11th, Claudio Chiappucci 18th and the American Andy Hampsten 37th. The 2 days in the Pyrenees had special significance in this year's rather flat race, and stage 12 took the riders from Pau into the Spanish city of Jaca, 192 kilometres. And by the time the riders began the descent of the Col de Soudet after 83.5 kilometres, Greg LeMond was in a field that was chasing down a group of riders. He was almost 4 minutes behind. Pascal Richard, the Swiss rider, had gone over the top of the Soudet in 1st place, and he was chased by Andy Hampsten, Luc Leblanc, Jan Nevens and this rider here, Maurizio Fondriest. So there was Luc Leblanc, the Frenchman, who was out to deliver a big surprise in this year's Tour de France, and Andy Hampsten also hoped he could deliver one as well. Greg LeMond was again on the defensive, and he was finding he had no friends in the Tour de France except his own teammates. And the best friend of all was this rider at the front, Gilbert Duclos-Lasalle, the grand man of the Tour de France and a very, very useful ally for Greg LeMond. So while the Z team chased behind, the leaders kept the rhythm up. They went over the Col d'Ischere. Pascal Richard was again first over that, led by Andy Hampsten, and then came the climb of the Col de Somport. This coming at around 160 kilometres and taking the riders into Spain. Greg LeMond couldn't understand it. Nobody else seemed interested in chasing the group ahead. Miguel Indurain, Pedro Delgado, Marina Lacharetta, Gianni Bugno, they all sat and watched, and Greg LeMond had to do all of the work, or his team did. This side is France, the other side of the building is Spain, and it was a Frenchman who was carrying the Tour de France into Spain. Luc Leblanc was going over the top of the Col de Somport with a lead of 16 seconds over Pascal Richard and the white jersey of Charlie Motte. Andy Hampsten was 4th, 1 minute and 5 seconds back, and the main field, including Greg LeMond, were an enormous 7 minutes and 15 seconds behind. Now once you enter Spain here, it is literally all downhill to Jaca. There was no chance now that this group wouldn't win the day. The question was, could the main field regroup and chase them down, or at least save some time? Greg LeMond was a little bit confused now. Nobody seemed to want to take up the chase. While down on the finishing line, Charlie Motte, taking into account the rest day as they flew down to Pau, was winning his second stage in a row. But the story was, of course, the race behind. This Tour de France was supposed to explode in the Pyrenees, and on this day, all of the riders who mattered seemed to stay together. Riders chipped off towards the finish to snatch seconds instead of minutes, while the main field came in, and they were led in by Frédéric Vichot of France, 6 minutes 55 seconds behind. This was becoming a great tour for the French and the Castorama team. They now had a new leader in Luc Leblanc. So the first day in the mountains were over. The race had a new leader, and Greg LeMond seemed to be a prisoner of the peloton.
Greg, it's been a very hard day in the mountains today, but you almost predicted what happened a couple of days ago.
Yeah, it's basically everybody in the peloton's racing, you know, for me to lose and for them to play poker and try to win. But, you know, it was a hard day.
You didn't have very many teammates there on the last climb.
No, that was a big disadvantage. My team wasn't riding as well as they thought they would, so that was a big handicap. Could be a big handicap for the rest of the tour.
But we saw you talking to Delgado's team there and to Bugno. Were you trying to tell them that they were losing the Tour de France as well?
Yeah, Bugno understood. Delgado and Duran, either they're all out, they're not capable of doing anything more, but if they're not, and they're just saving themselves, then I don't wish them the victory. I'd rather see a guy like winning. But I assume that maybe they're tired.
Were you worried about the lead that Luc Leblanc and Motte got?
The break, it's not that dangerous, no. The only thing I'm worried about is just the way that people ride in the race, and the fact that I have no teammates. It's going to be very difficult for me.
So you feel that if you lose the Tour de France, it will be really technically, physically you're good?
Physically I'm good. I think it'd be more tactical.
It was a nervous start to the stage now, the riders heading out towards their destiny, many knowing they must attack or lose the Tour de France. And the rider in the yellow jersey was now Luc Leblanc. He was leading the Tour de France by 2 minutes 35 seconds ahead of Greg LeMond, 3 minutes 52 seconds in front of Charlie Motte, and in fourth place was Maurizio Fondriest. Miguel Indurain was 4 minutes 44 seconds back in fifth place. There was nobody in any hurry whatsoever to reach their destiny in this year's Tour de France. The Pyrenees were still a few kilometres away. The smiling face of Luc Leblanc, he was doing something his more famous partner had never done, and that was Raymond Poulidor, because both riders come from Limousin. Poulidor had never worn the yellow jersey in the Tour de France, despite being one of the race's great legends. The eternal second, they always called him, and that was something that Luc Leblanc didn't want to be at the end of this day. The main field headed out to their destiny in the Pyrenees. By the end of the day, the Tour would be rewritten. The stage had made a quiet beginning over the Col de Portelet as the riders came back into France after 56 kilometres, Peter de Klerk winning the Prime at the top from the majority of the field. But then Guido Winterberg attacked at the feeding station at the base of the Col d'Aubisque, a climb which takes you 16 kilometres up into the sky. And then the chase behind had to begin somewhat in earnest. Yvon Madio, Guido Winterberg and Patrice Esnault, not the great names of the Tour de France, were now setting the pace. The Castorama team, in defence of Luc Leblanc and indeed Laurent Fignon here, were setting the pace behind. Greg LeMond was still in the peloton, so too was Gianni Bugno, so too Claudio Chiappucci, Pedro Delgado and Miguel Indurain. This was a long stage over terrific terrain. The riders were in no hurry yet to catch the leaders. Then the counter-attacks began. The first man to launch a pursuit of the three men out in front was Gianni Bugno, the champion of Italy and the world's #1 rider. Just a slight change in tempo as Bugno set off in pursuit now of Yvon Madio, Guido Winterberg and Patrice Esnault. They weren't too far ahead and certainly weren't out of reach, but they were now trying to draw the sting of the other big names of the Tour de France. The Col d'Aubisque is one of the classic climbs in the Tour de France. Like the Col de Tourmalet, it has been used since the early 1900s. Joined by Charlie Motte, the rhythm was increased and Bugno carried Motte across to the three leaders. Just around 96 kilometres covered now of the 232, and still of course the giant Col de Tourmalet to come, and the much feared finish on the top of Val Laurent. But this was the beginning now of the riders as they began to thin out. Claudio Chiappucci makes his acceleration and goes clear of the group containing Luc Leblanc. The yellow jersey, though, as they so often find, makes them a different type of cyclist. Leblanc was now a leader. He was now trying to win the Tour de France for France, and he was soon across to Chiappucci. It was on this mountain a few years ago in 1985 where Stephen Roche won his first ever stage of a Tour de France before he went on to win the race back in 1987. This year, of course, Stephen Roche was not in the race at all. He eliminated after that start in the team time trial. Chiappucci was a surprise last year when he finished second to Greg LeMond, but he's no longer a surprise in the world of cycling. He's now officially ranked the world's #2 rider, and this year he started well with a win in Milan-San Remo. Luc Leblanc, he turned professional at 20 years of age, a very young age indeed, and now at 24 he was coming into a fine state of maturity. He joined the Castorama team, he left the Belgian team where he wasn't successful, and it does seem as though Cyril Guimard, the manager of the Castorama boys, had found himself a new young star. The counterattacks continued on the long climb of the Col d'Aubisque, and the riders now were beginning to split up. They'd waited almost 2 weeks for this situation in the mountains of the Pyrenees, and now the legs were not finding the flat roads to their liking at all. This stage was all uphill. Leblanc had firmly latched himself onto the back of this leading group. There was no sign yet, though, of the other big names of the Tour de France. They were riding along in the second group, or the third, or even the fourth. Leblanc had built a lead of almost 3 minutes in this Tour de France, and he wasn't going to see it wiped away on one climb of a mountain called the Col d'Aubisque. The crowds, as ever, were turning out in their tens of thousands. The vast majority of them here on the Spanish borders were Spanish, and they wanted to see action from the Spanish riders. At the moment, though, the pace was being set by Gianni Bugno, the national champion from Italy. Also in this front group still were the early breakaways, Guido Winterberg, and the man from the Amaya team, Patrice Esnault. Charlie Motte, the little man with the white hat, on in third place here. He said he no longer had an interest in winning the Tour de France. He was only going to concentrate on winning one-day races. Now he was having a shot for yellow. The first rider to the top of the Col d'Aubisque was Guido Winterberg, the rider who had started this leading move way back at the feeding station at the bottom of the climb. Greg LeMond was only slightly off the pace and in the company too of Eduardo Chozas and Lucio Herrera, just a few seconds behind and still looking in aggressive mood. There are many riders now in the Tour de France who had come to find out just what it was like to ride this big classic race. The flatlands were gone, and for 2 weeks they may have held hopes of winning this race. In just about 2 hours, most of them knew they had no chance at all. After the descent of the Aubisque, the leaders had now arrived all as one on the climb of the Col de Tourmalet. The very word Tourmalet strikes fears into the heart. It's a long climb, and it takes the riders to the high spot at 9,000 feet. Claudio Chiappucci climbing with a great rhythm. Behind him was Charlie Motte and the tall figure of Miguel Indurain, always following at this stage and watching for every move. He was now in his home area. He knew these roads so well. The big, tall, handsome Spaniard, though, was without his lieutenant, Pedro Delgado. He'd missed the move. Greg LeMond was here and riding extremely strongly, and so too was the other American, Andy Hampsten. Andy's 29 years of age now, twice winner of the Tour of Switzerland and of the Tour of Italy, but he's yet to win the Tour de France. The pace remained very steady as the leaders continued to climb up the Col de Tourmalet. The notable absentee from this lead group was the 1988 winner, Pedro Delgado. At least he could take some solace from the thought that his team lieutenant, Miguel Indurain, was in the group. And many people thought that it was Indurain who was to be the real star of this Tour de France. And of course, they were right. Toward the top of the Tourmalet, Claudio Chiappucci was still setting the pace. The yellow jersey was hanging on in there too. But Greg LeMond was beginning to show signs of tiredness. He tried to attack on the Tourmalet. It hadn't worked and he'd fallen back. He'd been joined by the Italian Roberto Conti. A little sprint and over the top went Claudio Chiappucci in first place, followed by Indurain and Andy Hampsten. Gianni Bugno checking over his shoulder there to see where the yellow jersey was. He was only a few seconds back. And so too indeed was Greg LeMond, 18 seconds back to be exact. He'd now been joined by the Italian Conti, and of course it was downhill for quite a long way to the town of Santa Maria de Complin. And once down there, of course, we then faced the climb of the Col d'Aspin. There was no respite this day. There's a lot of skill involved in going down as well as going up, and it was on the way down that Miguel Indurain put in the attack. He'd noticed that Greg LeMond had lost contact towards the top, and he'd attacked immediately. By the time Greg LeMond had rejoined that chase group, Miguel Indurain had gone in fact for the rest of the day. Luc Leblanc was still riding at the back, still defending his lead, because he had quite a few minutes in hand over Miguel Indurain, more than 2 to be precise. So on the way down, Gérard Rouet looked across at Luc Leblanc. The riders were still trying to recuperate from the climb of the Col de Tourmalet. One man had no time to recuperate at all. He'd lost over a minute on the climb of the Tourmalet, and now Laurent Fignon was doing the ride of his life. The winner of the Tour de France in 1983 and 1984 was now chasing back towards the 8 leaders. Laurent Fignon, you never can tell just what he will do next. 184 kilometers covered, and it was time for Miguel Indurain now to stoke up with food. He had waited for this attack for the best part of 2 weeks. He'd ridden at the back of the field and gambled. He'd even gambled that very first day when he missed the breakaway which contained Eric Breukink and Greg LeMond. He could never have foreseen what would happen to Breukink, and he didn't know yet just how good LeMond was. Claudio Chiappucci decided the time was right to try and press on and join Miguel Indurain. And surprisingly, no one in the lead group chased him. Indurain was told that Chiappucci was coming up towards him, and in fact he slackened off the pace to allow Chiappucci to join him. Soon there would be 2 riders in the lead, and the rest of the Tour de France should have taken notice. Luc Leblanc was watching now his yellow jersey change shoulders unless he did something special on the climb of the Aspin, or indeed the climb up to the finish at Val Laurent. In this group too, Charlie Motte, Andy Hampsten, also Gérard Rouet, Greg LeMond and Roberto Conti. Sitting at the back, Gianni Bugno. It was time to take on food because the last 2 climbs of this day were viciously hard as well. No sooner had Bugno taken on food, and he wanted to see just how alert everybody else was. It's a classic move to attack at a feed station, and Bugno accelerated quickly, checking over his shoulder just to see if they were going to come and pick him up. The answer was, they were. Bugno had allowed 2 dangerous riders to escape. The same could be said for Greg LeMond, for Andy Hampsten, and for all the other riders who were thinking of winning the Tour de France. Miguel Indurain was no surprise. Everybody was talking about him, a man on form. And so, with 45 kilometers to go in the town of La Zéube, Indurain was joined by Claudio Chiappucci, while further down the road by a couple of minutes, Laurent Fignon had completed one of the rides of his life, and he's done plenty, and was catching back to the Le Mans group. He'd be disappointed to find that 2 riders were missing though, Indurain and Chiappucci. Gianni Bugno realised he'd made a big mistake. He'd allowed 2 riders too much of a lead, and time again he tried to pedal away from the chase group, but they were tenacious. Fignon joins at the back. Now the riders were strengthened by a great cyclist, and watch this. He doesn't even give them the courtesy of a glance, and they don't look at him either. He goes straight to the front and immediately tries to leave them. Greg LeMond knows Laurent Fignon only too well. He immediately takes his wheel. LeMond at this stage was still feeling strong. He still felt he could defend in this Tour de France. He tried on the Tourmalet. They caught him off guard when Indurain had attacked on the descent, but there was still a chance he could fight back. Leblanc gave the impression he was a rider always in trouble, but he was hanging on for as long as possible. Look at the gap there as he allows 3 riders their head. Fignon was driving this train along now. He was a man on a roll. He wanted to try and eat into the lead of the 2 men in front. Laurent Fignon continued to set the pace. Greg LeMond continued to follow. This was hurting Laurent Fignon, but you can always tell when you look at the face of Laurent Fignon whether it's hurting him because it really is tough, or whether it's hurting him because he's trying hard. And in this case, he's trying hard. The attack by Gianni Bugno is at an end, and Bugno is forced to go back into the line. The 2 riders up front, though, were out of sight. They weren't out of mind, but the roads now were preventing the riders getting back to them. The group continued to be driven along by just a couple of men, and Greg LeMond was one of those men. The other was Laurent Fignon. Charles Motte, in second place, was also willing to work, while Gianni Bugno was recovering from his many attacks. Little was seen of Luc Leblanc. He was content to hang on at the back of this leading group in the hope they would carry them back up towards the leading 2. LeMond knew he had to bridge the gap to these 2 leaders, because very shortly they would pull away. Next stop now was the climb of the Col d'Aspin, and the 2 riders out in front had built a lead of 2 minutes. Gerard Rouet riding for the first year for the Helvetia La Suisse team, having left Castorama, the team for which Luc Leblanc has now joined. They were now still rivals on the road. It wouldn't be long now before, in fact, Luc Leblanc's yellow jersey would not be his on the road. The gap was growing all of the time, and the 2 riders out front were gaining time, and the lead was shorter to swing even on the road to the Spanish rider Miguel Indurain. But there really was nothing that Luc Leblanc could do about it. The 2 riders were forming a perfect partnership. Indurain was setting the pace no more than Claudio Chiappucci. Chiappucci, don't forget, although he finished second in the Tour de France a year ago, has never won a stage in any major cycling tour, and now he was having his best chance. He was a long way behind Miguel Indurain in the overall classification as well. At the start of the day, he was 8 minutes 51 seconds behind Luc Leblanc, while Indurain was 4 minutes and 22. They were now building up to become 1 and 2 on the classification if things worked out. The Spanish spectators were enjoying every moment of this. They thought it might have happened the previous day on the road into Jaca. Instead, it's happened on this day, the road out of Spain and into Val Laurent. LeMond seemed to be one of the few riders in the chase group realising the urgency of the attack. He was continuing to try and stretch them, to try and tempt somebody out to come and join him. Gianni Bugno was one of those riders, and quickly LeMond takes his wheel. Champion of Italy, the world's #1, and the former winner of the Tour de France on 3 previous occasions, Greg LeMond. Eduardo Chozas from the Once team, they were having a quiet tour. Marina Lajaretta, their team leader, wasn't having a good tour at all. Chozas was still in this rather dwindling leading group as it cracked under the continued pressure of individual riders trying to strip away and catch up with the leaders. Gone from this group and accelerated into a front group was Charles Motte and Laurent Fignon and Andy Hampsten. This leading group had split up almost out of panic. The riders climbed up towards the top of the Col d'Aspin. It was continuing regrouping. Hampsten was back, so too was Motte, and the group was once again more or less complete. Pucci at the other end was building up a nice lead in the King of the Mountains competition. While of course Miguel Indurain was thinking more of winning the Tour de France. Le Mans was now beginning to show signs of being a tired man, yet his very spirit wouldn't allow him to drop away from the front of the chase group. He loves the Tour de France. He cannot believe anybody else can beat him to the win in Paris. He still continued to drive this breakaway along, although inside he could not have felt very well at all. News was coming over Tour radio all of the time of riders giving up the Tour de France because they were now spread over a long time. And LeBlanc too was now in trouble. Towards the top of the Col d'Aspin, the plucky little Frenchman was being dropped by the leading group. He was watching everybody sail away from him. His day had been on the road to Haka. Now the yellow jersey was on his shoulders. He found, like Greg LeMond had previously, you have no friends in the Tour de France. Fignon had calmed down as well after that brilliant chase across to the leading group and the attempt to split them up. He now seemed more content to wait for the last big climb to the finish, to Val Laurent. As the slopes of the Col d'Aspin became steeper, the leading group continued to struggle. Greg LeMond was now back behind the wheel of Eduardo Chozas. Helvetia La Suisse rider Gerard Rouet was in fourth place, while at the front, Miguel Indurain and Claudio Chiappucci were driving a train which was becoming a runaway. Major time gaps were now opening over the rest of the field. The main field was reported to be more than 12 minutes behind. That was if you could find a main field. These riders were riding at around 4 minutes back. The gaps were now enormous. The panic bells really should have been ringing, but could they do anything about it? They'd found two riders who had committed themselves to what they knew would be the hardest stage of the Tour de France. They'd waited 2 weeks, they'd watched every move, they gambled on missing big breakaways. Now they were having their day, and the other stars of the Tour were all on the defensive. And with the two leaders at the front of the road, further down, Greg LeMond, a bizarre crash, hit from the back by the team car of Gianni Bugno. In fact, Gianni Bugno had just attacked and the team car was going forward to service him, and Greg LeMond was hit from behind. It was a bizarre accident, and in fact the team manager serviced LeMond and later sought him out to apologise for the error. LeMond just got on with the job in hand. It would upset his rhythm though. Now he had to try and get back into it again. The two leaders, of course, were unaware of what was happening further down the mountain, and the climbers were now spread over many minutes. It was still a good 2.5 minutes back to Bugno, Motte, Fignon, and even further back to Hampsten, LeMond, Chozas and Rouet. And the main field, men like Pedro Delgado, were over 10 minutes behind. LeMond was still being left to do the majority of the work. What a great fighter this American is. The other three were just following him. Up towards the top of the Col d'Aspin, no big sprint here. Over the top of the Col d'Aspin, just 36 kilometres remain of this really severe stage. Gianni Bugno, Charlie Motte and Laurent Fignon were the next riders to head up the Aspin, but they were now 2 minutes and 15 seconds behind the two leaders. Bugno realised only too well now he'd made a big mistake in allowing Indurain and Chiappucci such an early escape. But you know, in big-time cycle racing, it's sometimes worth gambling on a long one, and that's exactly what Indurain had planned to do. Only Chiappucci had realised it. The next group over contained Hampsten, LeMond, Chozas and Gerard Rouet. They were 3 minutes and 34 seconds behind the leaders and over a minute now behind the trio of Bugno, Motte and Fignon. So for the last time this day, the riders were heading downhill off the Col d'Aspin, heading down towards the valley before the long climb out to the finishing line at Val Laurent. The climb of Val was a climb with an average gradient of in excess of 9%, and it was around about 7 kilometres to the finishing line. The two leaders now were well clear. The three chasers were just trying to limit their losses at this point. Gianni Bugno still felt he had some fight left in him and was waiting for the chance now to shed himself of Laurent Fignon and Charlie Motte. Further down though, Greg LeMond was now in all sorts of trouble, and this group had been joined by LeMond's teammate Eric Boyer. Boyer was riding at the front, trying to tempt Greg LeMond to keep up with him. The yellow jersey, by the way, of Luc Leblanc had gone over the top of the Col d'Aspin with a deficit of 6 minutes and 42 seconds, and that, believe me, is a long way behind the lead. Eric Boyer in the Z team was still trying to pull what was left in the reserves of Greg LeMond to the good. This was the first time in any Tour de France for Greg LeMond he had taken a big packet. He'd hit the wall in a big way. Pace was beginning to tell even on the face now of Claudio Chiappucci as they headed up towards the finish at Val-Thorens, but Indurain looked equally as strong. Further behind them though, Gianni Bugno was now making one last desperate attempt to close that gap. He was over 2 minutes behind, and he really had to reduce that by at least half to stay in with a chance of winning this Tour de France. Fignon saw him go, and Fignon tried to bridge the gap, and for a moment at least he had Charlie Motte in trouble. The crowd were loving every minute of what was a great stage of the Tour de France. So he tried this so many times on so many mountains this day, but finally Gianni Bugno was on his own. Behind those three, the group of five were still staying together. Greg LeMond rocking and rolling at the back, Eric Boyer keeping an eye on him. Wearing the magic number of 51, Gianni Bugno was now riding in third place on the road. Number 51, by the way, is the number that's been worn by more winners of the Tour de France than any other number in the race. 2 minutes is the sign that comes from the official car, Albert Vouvet telling Gianni Bugno he is 2 minutes behind the two riders who have tried all day to steal the show. And Laurent Fignon still continues to fight. He recovered from that long chase across the valley road, and he's still riding a great race in the Pyrenees. Charlie Motte hanging on to a rejuvenated Fignon. Hanging on perhaps wasn't quite the word, because it looked as though Laurent Fignon was about to leave Charlie Motte. But this was the battle that was going on behind these two riders. There's no doubt now that by this time Indurain and Chiappucci have been told by the team managers as they went through the 4 kilometres to go banner that Bugno was chasing. So, although they'd had the day to themselves, they really could not afford to ease up yet. They had to keep the pressure on. This was the day they'd both chosen as their big day in the Tour de France, and they weren't going to let it go to waste now. Greg LeMond was just hoping that soon this day would be over. Boyer was staying with him, and LeMond was still trying to follow him. The other three continued to follow LeMond and Boyer. Names like Pedro Delgado were now riding over 12 to 13 minutes behind the leaders. Luc Leblanc, by the way, was now 10 minutes behind the leaders. The yellow jersey certainly wouldn't be for him this day. Under the same 4 kilometre go, where just a couple of minutes ago the two leaders have passed, comes Laurent Fignon, and slowly but surely Charlie Motte is losing ground to the former French champion. But these are the names now that we would talk about for the rest of this year's Tour de France. Gianni Bugno, one-time favourite, is now the big challenger. The two riders who slipped away were now nearly at the finishing line. Charlie Motte, 2 stage wins under his belt this year and no more water required for this stage, was still in with a high chance of a top classification finish. So the climb of Val-Thorens that all riders had feared, they'd done well to do so. It was so vicious after such a long day in the mountains. 232 kilometres almost completed, and they crossed the mountains which the French once called the Circle of the Valley of the Dead Men, and there were plenty of those to be seen today. Not least, of course, was Greg LeMond, but strangely enough, Greg LeMond was making more friends in this year's Tour de France, not because he was losing, but because he wasn't giving up when he wasn't winning. And Greg LeMond was suffering silently behind the wheel of Eric Boyer, just hoping soon the finishing line would be with him. Of course, all of his critics were saying, which day would he now give up the Tour de France, because for sure he was never going to win it. One of the two riders in the lead seems certain now, barring accident, to win this year's Tour de France. They built such a lead over everybody else, and the design of this course this year was such there was only 2 more mountain stages to come and 1 time trial. All the road races in between were really for the sprinters or the gamblers. Even the Basques were cheering a Frenchman here because they had their man in the lead, and Fignon wasn't too impressed. The final kilometre, the red kite in the sky, and Miguel Indurain, as he so often does in the Pyrenees, was heading up towards the chance of a stage win. He's won twice in the Pyrenees before, in fact in nearby valleys. He wasn't going to win for a 3rd time, as Claudio Chiappucci sprints ahead to take the victory by 1 second. Chiappucci's first ever big stage win in a major stage race. He was absolutely delighted. But of course the man who is now the new name in the Tour de France is Miguel Indurain. He was to become now the new leader and the man to pull on the leader's yellow jersey. He was now going to lead this race by 3 minutes. Gianni Bugno came home, he hung on, and he improved over those last few kilometres. He actually finished 1 minute and 29 seconds behind Chiappucci. There was still just an element of doubt as to who would win this year's Tour de France. And the great performance by Laurent Fignon. He finished 4th, 2 minutes 50 seconds back. What did it take out of him? Charlie Motte, who'd been in the thick of the action all day, came home in 5th place, but he too was a long way back, 3 minutes and 53 seconds. 2 stage wins, there wouldn't be a yellow jersey in this year's Tour de France. And Andy Hampson was now the best American, in 6th place on the day, 6 minutes and 1 second back, followed by Eduardo Chozas. Then came Greg LeMond, led home by his faithful teammate Eric Boyer. Greg LeMond had hit the wall and had really blown up. He came in 7 minutes and 18 seconds behind Claudio Chiappucci, the rider he beat in last year's Tour de France. This has now given a new light to the overall classification. As the race prepared to leave the Pyrenees, Miguel Indurain was leading by 3 minutes from Charlie Motte, 3 minutes 10 seconds ahead of Gianni Bugno. The new king of the mountains was Claudio Chiappucci. For the Italian and for the Spanish, it had been a great day out. Never before has Miguel Indurain pulled on the leader's yellow jersey in the Tour de France, and he pulled it on with a ride that was going down in the books as one of the great rides of any Tour de France. So after that great battle of the Pyrenees, the roads were not quite so angry for the 14th stage, a ride of 172.5 kilometres, taking the riders from Saint-Gaudens to Castres. Miguel Indurain, after his fine assault in the Pyrenees, was all smiles in the yellow jersey. Greg LeMond had a lot to think about. The rest of the riders knew now he was a real leader of this year's Tour de France. The roads are extremely hot. They favour perhaps the Italian riders, and an attack by Bruno Chengialta should have been taken note of. Chengialta, by the way, was the rider who gave his bike to Rolf Sorensen when he crashed at Valenciennes. Now he was having his great day at Castres, winning the stage there. He finished in fact just 20 seconds ahead of Jean-Claude Colotti and Giovannetti of Italy, but the rest of the race weren't worried about them. The race rolled on again, continuing in the shimmering heat of the Languedoc area of France. Stage 15 took the riders from Albi across to Alès, 235 kilometres, and no one was in any mood to attack early on. It really was extremely hot and extremely humid. Before this Tour de France began, there were many experts saying it was in this region where the Tour de France could be won, because the roads were up and down, very short and sharp. But they weren't anticipating the big gap by Miguel Indurain, nor the heat of the south. Water was the name of the day, and it was carried here by the water carrier Thierry Claverola, who last year was the winner of the King of the Mountains title. It took on rather a Mexican setting as the riders rolled in towards the finish, and then the breakaway was formed by Moreno Argentin, the only significant climb of the race. By standards so far, it wasn't that tough, but it was used as a springboard by Argentin to go clear. and by the finish in Alice, he was the stage winner. Win number 2 out of 2 days for the Ariostia team. No change overall at all. Greg LeMond had refused to give up this race, and many people said he would. He was now proving to be a man of great courage, and not just a rider who could win the Tour, but one who could lose it with grace as well. This was the stage that took the riders across to Gap, 215 kilometres. That seemed to be the question of the day, and the question of the crash helmets was still unresolved. Every day now the riders were being fined $150 for not wearing them. The fines were mounting up, but by the end of the season the rule would be changed. The fines would never be paid, and the riders would have the right to choose to wear a crash helmet or not to wear one. And in the Tour de France the vast majority chose not to. The roads to Gap were up and down. They were a little hors d'oeuvre as the riders head towards the gateway to the Alps. But whether it was a moment in attention or a moment of weakness, Miguel Indurain was put on the defensive when there was an attack by Claudio Chiappucci, Laurent Fignon and Gianni Bugno. They exchanged water bottles between one another and they raced flat out. They put the Banesto team under extreme pressure, and for quite a while it made exciting cycling. Laurent Fignon, I told you never know what he's going to do next, really did try to drive this breakaway along, but they were brought back, and as soon as they were caught, Greg LeMond launched an attack with Gap just down to his right. But any great comeback in this Tour by Greg LeMond was to be spoilt by being joined by the Italian rider Marco Lieti, and for the 3rd day in succession an Ariostia rider was winning the stage. The funny thing was that Lieti, as a young rider, once admired Greg LeMond when he raced past his house in the Tour of Italy. He never dreamt that one day he would beat the great man to a stage win in the Tour de France. And Greg, who had not been enjoying his Tour de France of late, was fighting back. Here he is again talking to Paul Sherwin after the finish.
Greg, just ask me a couple of questions, please. This morning there were lots of rumours about your illness and you might not be continuing.
My illness, I had a blood test after Valderon. My white blood count was way up, which indicates, actually could indicate just a big fatigue or a small infection. But I think it was abnormal for me to ride the way I did in Valderon. It was abnormal.
Vous laissez travailler la presse, s'il vous plaît.
De quoi tu souffrais exactement?
Greg,
Greg,
your team doctor said that if you were ill, a couple of days and you may well be competitive again for the mountains and the Alps.
Well, I feel better, much better than say 3 days ago, that's for sure. But today, everybody says all 3 days before to recuperate. This isn't recuperation today. Yesterday wasn't recuperation. The day before wasn't recuperation. The day off is recuperation.
These stages have been extremely hard, but today's performance must make you feel a lot more comfortable.
I feel better than yesterday, but I am not confident at all for tomorrow. I'm just going to follow the best I can.
But for Lieti, joy turned into sadness next morning because Marco Lieti was involved in a crash while warming up for the start of the stage and retired with a broken leg. Stage 17 took the riders away from Gap and up to the heights of Alpe d'Huez, 125 kilometres. Attacking all day have been the Spanish rider Pello Ruiz Cabestany and the local rider Thierry Bourguignon. But by the time the riders came to Alpe d'Huez, they weren't too far behind the 2 leaders. Thierry Claverola in the white jersey was the king of the mountains in the Tour de France a year ago, and he put up a great performance on this mountain. He was in the lead group again. So too was the Frenchman Jean-Francois Bernard in the services now of the leader of the Tour de France, Miguel Indurain. And Gianni Bugno knew, a gap of 3 minutes 10 seconds over the yellow jersey Miguel Indurain, this climb of Alpe d'Huez just had to count. He won the stage up here last year, the first time since Fausto Coppi from Italy had won in the 1950s. That was nothing. This time he was racing for yellow. Jean-Francois Bernard setting the pace and Miguel Indurain resting as best he could behind him in his slipstream. The polka dot jersey of the king of the mountains, and that was Claudio Chiappucci now, and the normal team colours of Luc Leblanc, who led for just 1 day in the Pyrenees. he was still remaining quite a challenge in this Tour, but no longer for first place. Alpe d'Huez is a marvellous climb. 21 numbered bends take the riders up to its summit, and the crowds come in the thousands. As the leaders continued to keep their tempo, they headed up towards the summit of Alpe d'Huez. Miguel Indurain was still being paced by his faithful teammate, Jean-Francois Bernard. It was a similar scene to 1 year ago when it was Robert Miller from Britain and the Z team who was helping Ronan Pensek up this big climb in defence of his yellow jersey. Of course, Pensek went on to lose the Tour de France, and teammate Greg LeMond then went on to win it. This was a marvellous piece of team riding by Bernard, a rider who's come back to big form, having left the French teams and moved across to the Spanish sides. Ruiz Cabasani was now paying the price of his attack, which had lasted most of the day and was beginning to slide away from the picture. Gianni Bugno still could find no answer to the man in yellow. Everything he did, Indurain was ready to match. And the crowd had waited here for hours upon hours, and in fact maybe days upon days, were now witnessing what could be seen as the final big showdown in this year's Tour de France, because Bugno seemed as though he couldn't do anything about the following of Miguel Indurain. Enough of the pacemaking, and Bugno would now have liked somebody else to come along and give him a hand, but there wasn't anybody. After Indurain, Bugno was the strongest rider in this group. Claudio Chiappucci in the polka dot jersey, as leader of the King of the Mountains, was content to watch as well. And Steven Rooks was trying now to produce a good performance for Holland, because over the years Dutch riders have won more times up this climb than any other nation. But even this wasn't to be the day for Steven Rooks. His turn was to come in the upcoming World Championships later in the year, when he would finish second. Bugno, number 3 in this year's Tour de France, was applying the pressure, but numbers 1 and 2 seemingly able to follow him everywhere he went. Jean-Francois Bernard, despite the fact he dropped back a little bit here on Bugno's acceleration, was still pedalling smoothly back up to the side of his team leader, and of course the leader of the Tour de France, Thierry Claverola, and also here too was the little Frenchman Luc Leblanc. The French were said at the beginning of this year's Tour de France they wouldn't have any candidate for victory. Well, that's true to say now. They haven't, but they've had men in the picture all the way through. The acceleration by Bugno has been countered. Further down the mountain, Laurent Fignon was again trying to produce one of his great fightbacks. He loves Alpe d'Huez, he's won the yellow jersey here, and every time he's done that, he's won the Tour de France. But he was a little bit behind the pace just now. Up around the cemetery in the town of Huez, there's now approximately 3.5 kilometres to go to the summit, and for the first time since they left the valley of Bourg d'Oisans, the riders can see the town of Alpe d'Huez. Steven Rooks is making progress too. He was crossing the gap, slowly but surely. And Laurent Fignon was leading a charge, and alongside him was Pedro Delgado, an anonymous figure in this year's Tour de France. And what about Greg LeMond? He was struggling as well. He was riding the lower slopes with Charlie Motte. The crowds were now at their thickest as the riders approached the summit of Alpe d'Huez. Even Claudio Chiappucci was now beginning to appear human for the first time in this year's Tour de France. He was dangling off the back. And Jean-Francois Bernard, he simply would not give up. Neither would Laurent Fignon, who continued to make the pace from the back. Rider number 116, Alvaro Mejia, a name you should note, because he could be a Tour de France winner in the next 2 years. He's a great newcomer from Colombia. Finally, Jean-Francois Bernard found the pace he'd set at the beginning had certainly kept his leader in the position he wanted to be in. And he was alongside the world's number 1, Gianni Bugno, a rider in his 4th Tour de France, the national champion, the World Cup holder, and undoubtedly the man on form. But he wasn't able to do anything about Miguel Indurain, who'd ridden well in the Tour of Spain and was now looking like winning the Tour de France. Claudio Chiappucci, just a few kilometres from the summit, was now in trouble. He was holding his rhythm as best he could, but he was not going to improve now on his overall position in the Tour de France. Gianni Bugno was making his play. He had to win this stage and win it with a time gain over Miguel Indurain, and Indurain himself was not going to come through and give him a hand. Bugno wanted Indurain to come and make the pace, but why should he? He was the leader of the Tour de France. It's Bugno who should be attacking the Spaniard, not the other way around. And further down the mountain too, the little rider Thierry Claverola, who rides this mountain so well, was still riding strongly. He was hoping to again win the King of the Mountains in the Tour de France, but Claudio Chiappucci was spoiling the party. Bugno, Indurain and Luc Leblanc. Chiappucci had now dropped back, and Luc Leblanc was having another good first day in the mountains. He'd done it in the Pyrenees, now he was doing it in the Alps. Jean-Francois Bernard, the Frenchman, his job done for the day, is now trying to hang on for a good finish. His attacking riding up the slopes had given him plenty of time in hand over the majority of the riders in the Tour de France. And so he continued, just a little bit off the pace. Gianni Bugno was not riding like the great Eddy Merckx. There was no way he could deliver a killer blow that would knock out Miguel Indurain. Indurain had watched and followed for 10 days on the flat stages, and now he was doing exactly the same in Alpe d'Huez. He'd made his play on one long day in the Pyrenees, and now he was going to hang on to his time gains. The gauntlet was down, the others had to pick it up. The massive crowd, so synonymous now with Alpe d'Huez, that it has become indeed the most famous mountain probably in the history of the Tour de France. And the riders know by the density of the crowd, even if they've never climbed this mountain before, that the finish can't be too far away. And as that finish approaches, Indurain takes the lead. Bugno follows, and as usual, Luc Leblanc shows the courage behind and hangs on in. The ski chalets of Alpe d'Huez, a town that normally comes to life in the ski season, but on this particular day in July, it was very much alive for Miguel Indurain and Gianni Bugno. Indurain never looks troubled, does he? He just sits there, watches and waits. He's a strong, strong rider, and Bugno, looking ever so frail alongside him, could not find the answers, nor could he find a single chink in the armour of the man in yellow. 2 kilometres to go, the first 9 riders on the road were separated by no more than a minute. Indurain, Leblanc, and behind these 3 came Jean-Francois Bernard and the Dutchman Steven Rux, and also Chiappucci, Claverola and Pedro Delgado. Laurent Fignon was just about a minute and 10 seconds behind. This was Pedro Delgado, number 31, still making progress. He caught up now with Steven Rux and also with Claudio Chiappucci. A time gap around about 45 seconds off the head of the pace. And Thierry Claverola riding just like he did a year ago, sometimes with the leaders and sometimes by himself. One thing's for sure, he never gives up. Into the town of Alpe d'Huez, now just crossing the square, and then it's a left turn and you see the finishing line. A year ago it was Greg LeMond who was fighting out the finish in the yellow jersey, and it was Gianni Bugno who was beating him. This year in yellow it's Miguel Indurain, and Gianni Bugno is still there, and still there with a chance to beat a man in yellow yet again. Greg LeMond had fallen back. He was just about scraping into the top 20 on the road at the moment, and approximately 2 minutes behind. Leblanc still hanging on at the back, and you know what they say about a rider: when you see the finishing banner, you suddenly find your strength again. Could he win the stage for France, the one that everybody wants to win, the top of Alpe d'Huez, the one that everybody seems to talk about in the years that follow? Heading across the wide open street to the sharp left turn, the yellow jersey of Miguel Indurain. Bugno in second place, trying to become a man to win the stage for the first time ever in 2 consecutive years. Bugno has the best position for a sprinter in second place. He's also one of the best sprinters. And we weren't to know it here, of course, but in 4 weeks' time, we were watching what was a dress rehearsal for the World Championship. And Gianni Bugno, one look over his shoulder and he unleashes his sprint. And for the second year in succession, he not only wins the stage, but he beats the man in the yellow jersey. This year, of Miguel Indurain. But for Indurain, having finished second on the major mountain stage in the Pyrenees and now finishing second here on the major mountain stage in the Alps, he knew that this Tour de France was running very nicely in his direction. Jean-Francois Bernard came home and he finished in 4th place 35 seconds later. And then a little sprint between Stephen Rooks, Claudio Chiappucci, Tilly Clavarola and at the back Pedro Delgado. Victory to Rooks, he took 5th place. Just over a minute had gone by when the appearance of Laurent Fignon fighting out for 9th place. Just in front of him at the moment was Mejia, but he was to finish behind Laurent Fignon. So Fignon dropped a little bit on Alpe d'Huez. His overall position wouldn't suffer too much though. And Laurent Fignon came home just a minute and 12 seconds behind Gianni Bugno. After Fignon had arrived, Greg LeMond's group had found company. And Greg LeMond, in 3rd place here, was being led home by Uwe Ampler of Germany. And they were coming in 1 minute 58 seconds later. Greg LeMond was still getting stronger day by day. He may no longer be within a chance of winning the Tour, but he was now still in with a chance of putting up a very creditable performance. He was angry. That's a good sign when you talk to Greg. The next day, the riders said goodbye to the Alps with a long stage of 255 kilometres, which took them from Bourg d'Oisans right through to Morzine. This should have been another very difficult day, but the weather turned absolutely torrential rain, and because of this, I think it actually helped Miguel Indurain keep his race lead. There weren't too many riders willing to take chances going down mountains when the roads were covered in floodwater. In these atrocious conditions, there was a race-long attack that came from Thierry Clavarola and Thierry Bourguignon. Bourguignon lived locally, and he wanted to do well in the Alps. He also wanted a place in the upcoming World Championships. Thierry Clavarola knew now that he wasn't going to be such a marked man, because he'd lost all hope of scoring 1st place in the Tour de France. Clavarola was in fact 38 minutes behind on the overall classification. He wasn't going to pull back too much time. He went over the top of the Col d'Aravis in 1st place in a small group which contained Roberto Conti, Frederic Vichot, Camargo of Colombia and a couple of other Spanish riders. None of the big names had seen their chance to break away. Indeed, none had wanted to in the conditions, but one of the big names was in trouble and Greg LeMond was no longer enjoying the Tour de France yet again. As the riders made their way up towards the Col de Colombière, Greg LeMond was now being consoled by his faithful teammate, Gilbert Duclos-Lassalle. Duclos-Lassalle clearly said something to LeMond, and LeMond took his wheel. It was now the job of Gilbert Duclos-Lassalle to literally drag Greg LeMond from the back of the Tour de France to the front. There were even reports at one stage that Greg LeMond was in tears, and that must have made him angry. It also won him many, many friends in this year's Tour de France, because it would have been so easy to get off your bike in these conditions and say goodbye to the Tour. Greg LeMond instead took off his racing cape and showed them what he was made of. Greg LeMond was now being prepared to take on the Tour de France at least this stage and try and improve his position on the road. He still had the climb of the Col de Colombière to come, and of course then after that the climb of the Col de Jouplan. For the moment the rain had stopped, but conditions on the Jouplan were reported to be very, very bad. So bad in fact the helicopters couldn't fly and there were no pictures available to show you. Greg LeMond was dragged back up towards the first echelons of the bunches in the Tour de France at the back of the field. Gilbert Duclos-Lassalle was doing a great job. And just watch now as Duclos-Lassalle brings Greg LeMond to this big group of riders, a group of riders who think their Tour de France today is over and they're only riding towards the finish. It wasn't good enough for LeMond, and as you see, the riders watch LeMond go straight by. Michel Dernier spots a good wheel and he takes the back wheel of Greg LeMond and Gilbert Duclos-Lassalle. They call this the autobus. It's the group where the riders always form themselves in the hope that together they can set a pace that will keep them within the Tour de France and not actually being eliminated by being outside of the daily time limit. Greg LeMond didn't want to be a passenger on the autobus. He wanted to be once more the great champion he's always been. So the bad start to the day, Le Monde gritted his teeth, and using the wheel of Duclos-Lassalle, he was heading back up towards a respectable finish at Morzine. Phil Anderson, the winner of the stage in the early parts of the Tour de France, he too sees the train come by, and like Michel Dernisse, takes the back wheel of Greg LeMond. The other rider from Panasonic is Malk van Orso. I wonder how many times this day Greg LeMond had offered the thought to himself to give up the Tour de France. And it's this very reason that now people talk of Greg in different terms in Europe. They now see him as a man of great courage. Eventually Duclos-Lassalle falls away, his pacemaking done, but Greg LeMond keeps up the rhythm. Heading up the Col de la Colombière, Greg LeMond picks the riders off one by one. He's steadily working his way back up towards the leaders of the Tour. He won't catch them, but he will certainly have a good finish at the end of the stage. This was about the only time this day the rain actually stayed off. As the riders go higher, so the cloud comes down. The roads are wet. Marina Lajareta, among others, was crashing on the climb of the Col de la Colombière. Conditions changed again as they headed up towards the summit. Thierry Bourguignon in the lead throughout most of the day, along with Thierry Claverola, who's still trying to get the stage win that has eluded him. He's riding stronger by the day, and because he lives in the Alps, he believes he knows all of the roads. Thierry Claverola, the man who is now over half an hour behind. He wasn't at the king of the mountains like he was last year either, but there was still an outside chance with a good performance he could catch up with Claudio Chiappucci and win that particular competition. And as usual, Miguel Indurain was following his #1 enemy, the rider in the green, red and white, the champion of Italy, Gianni Bugno. The top 3 riders in the Tour were content to ride side by side. Over the top of the Col de la Colombière, the rain was coming, and the left-hand corners were becoming a little more difficult. Thierry Claverola was the first over the mountain, and the Jouplan was to come. No pictures, I'm afraid, and then the finish. Bourguignon second over the top of La Colombière there, and then it was down to the finish in Morzine, and it was an easy victory for Thierry Claverola. He sprinted away from Bourguignon, clapped his hands, and he was the winner. The next stage of 177 kilometres carried the riders away from the Alps and took them to the beautiful town of Aix-les-Bains on the side of the lake. It was a chance now for the riders to recuperate after their 2 tough days in the Alps, and also a chance too for them to dry out. And so Indurain had come away from all of the mountains in this year's Tour de France, not only conserving all of his time, but holding a lead of over 3 minutes over the second man in the race, Gianni Bugno. Gianni Bugno 3 minutes 9 seconds back, Claudio Chiappucci third, 4 minutes 48 seconds back. The final day's time trial to come was seemingly not going to be too significant. There was a long breakaway this stage by the Tour of Spain winner Melchior Mauri, but although he stayed away for most of the day, eventually the field swept him up. He did puncture near the end and a back wheel change, but it really didn't matter anymore. By this stage the field were catching up. It only prolonged the agony just a little bit. But when they did catch up, it gave a chance then to the Soviet rider Dmitry Konishev to go clear in a small group of riders, along with Pascal Richard and Eduardo Chozas. And these riders began to break away towards the end of the stage. Dmitry Konishev riding here in second place, the first Soviet rider ever to win a stage of the Tour de France, which he did at Pau last year. He was to be a favourite this year for the Tour, but he crashed in the Tour of Spain, badly breaking his collarbone. And now he was hoping not to crash this time like Roberto Conti. The trouble with this rider is he climbs mountains really well. He has a big problem going down. Heading up towards the finish, Dmitry Konishev left little chance for the former champion of Switzerland, Pascal Richard. Try as he might, he wasn't going to get by the Soviet rider. So victory to Konishev. In third place, coming up on the rails, was Eduardo Chozas. He was just 11 seconds behind. And then a big sprint, and it was Greg LeMond again returning to form, who led home Stephen Rooks and Gerard Rouet for fourth place. And that represented a gain for Greg LeMond on the day over race leader Miguel Indurain of 1 minute and 36 seconds as the main field came in, led home by Jamaluddin Abdu-Japarov. The stage victory went to Konishev. Stage 20 took the riders on from Aix-les-Bains to Mâcon and into the final 400 kilometres of this year's Tour de France. Nobody, at the beginning at least, was in any hurry to meet the capital of the wine country. The rain was still threatening, and the hot sunshine of some 7 days earlier down south of the Alps had left us, but there were still plenty of riders who felt they were in with a chance of at least winning a stage. Claudio Chiappucci had used the early part of the day to consolidate his lead in the King of the Mountains. He'd won 2 of the day's 4 small climbs. And then a small group of 4 riders broke clear. Henrik Redant, Marc Sergeant, Jamaldin Abdou-Japarov and Brian Home. But they weren't given more than 20 seconds advantage over the field. And just as they were about to be caught, Redant went again. This one, he thought, was the good tactic. As you're being brought back, why not try another attack? Sometimes the riders give up, but they didn't this time. And it was Vyacheslav Yekimov who broke away in the last few kilometres of the race. Yekimov, the reigning World Pursuit champion, was now yet another Soviet rider to win a stage of this year's Tour de France. But the whole field was only 7 seconds behind, and it was Soviets first, second, and in third place was the former East German Olaf Ludwig. The penultimate day's time trial in the Tour de France has often been crucial. It wasn't so this year, the 57 kilometres taking the riders from Lugny back to Mâcon. Greg LeMond's immediate target in this time trial now was not the yellow jersey, but that of Andy Hampsten, his former American teammate. LeMond was still racing to become the best American finisher in this year's Tour de France. He needed to beat Andy Hampsten by more than 2 minutes 42 seconds. As he approached the finish, it was all too clear he'd done it. He set the best time as he arrived home, 1 hour 12 minutes and 33 seconds. Andy Hampsten was starting the time trial in 7th place overall, but Greg LeMond wasn't too far behind him. There was a real possibility that Greg could overtake him. Hampsten's time for the ride, 1 hour 15 minutes and 42 seconds. Claudio Chiappucci lost the Tour de France in the final time trial 1 year ago. He swore then he would learn how to ride alone against the watch, and he really did shock the stars when he recorded the best time at the first time check. But after that he did continue to slow down. Greg LeMond had already finished with the best time so far. Claudio Chiappucci was now serving to consolidate his 3rd place overall in this year's Tour de France. He approached the finish, and by the time he hit the line, his time was 1 hour 12 minutes and 53 seconds. Gianni Bugno started the Tour de France time trial 3 minutes 9 seconds behind the leader overall. And for a while he was looking as though he might pick up a few seconds on Miguel Indurain. At 2 of the splits he was recording the best time. But when it came to the finish, his time was better than Greg LeMond's, but Miguel Indurain was still to finish. Miguel Indurain's fine performance in this time trial now was no surprise, because after all, he'd won the first time trial of the Tour de France, which now seemed a long time ago, and it was almost 3 weeks. At the first check though, Chiappucci had been the fastest time, and Bugno and Indurain had gone through in exactly the same time, 26 minutes and 57 seconds. They were both 21 seconds slower than Chiappucci. But whereas Chiappucci slowed down, Indurain just kept his rhythm going. By the time he came to the finish, there was no doubt left, if there ever was, that Miguel Indurain was going to win this year's Tour de France. Gianni Bugno was gaining nothing, and in fact he was losing more time. 3 minutes 9 seconds behind at the start of this time trial. By the end of the day, Gianni Bugno will be now 3 minutes and 36 seconds behind. Miguel Indurain had chosen the 4 crucial stages of the Tour de France to strike, won both the time trials and finished second in the 2 serious mountain stages. He was the only rider to finish with a time inside 1 hour 12 minutes, 1 hour 11 minutes 45 seconds to be precise. He had won the time trial, and now he would win the Tour de France in Paris the next day. The final stage, a ride of 178 kilometres from Melun into Paris and the Champs-Élysées. The Eiffel Tower, the sight that every rider wanted to see, and it was to be Greg LeMond who saw it first. He broke away on the outskirts of Paris, and as he told me later, it really was just a little piece of theatre. But at this stage, it looked as though he was trying to be the first man to win the stage in Paris. The main field behind, all being escorted by the Benesto team of Miguel Indurain. They weren't worried about Greg LeMond, and this must be surely the first time ever that no leader of the Tour de France was. Greg LeMond chatted and even smiled with the officials of the organisation of the Tour de France as he raced along the banks of the River Seine. The riders were soon onto the Champs-Élysées, and it's a great moment in any professional rider's career to be the first man through the start-finishing line for the laps of the Champs-Élysées. 8 laps in all of the circuit to be completed, and as you can see, it's all uphill towards the Arc de Triomphe. But I suppose that means it's all downhill back to the back of the circuit here. Greg LeMond was first onto the course, and the rest of the Tour de France were all lining up to pick him up. The yellow jersey of Miguel Indurain settled nicely at the head of the field, and he must have now been feeling a very, very happy man indeed. It was to be a day for the sprinters, but first of all, they had to catch Greg LeMond. The rider who'd had a very unusual Tour de France for him, he was about to finish in 7th place overall, his worst ever finish, and yet for many riders, they could never have a hope of attaining such a high finish. They had to work hard to catch Greg LeMond, and when they did, they swept him up very, very quickly indeed. Laurent Fignon, Miguel Indurain, they were still looking for the attacks that might work. Although everybody expects a bunch finish on the Champs-Élysées, you don't always get one, and you must stay alert right up until the very end of the race. But although the field did break up, they finally regrouped, and every little split was brought back into the main field. It was now giving a chance to Jumaluddin Abdu-Japarov, the rider who was about to win this race on the green point section as the most consistent daily finisher. He'd certainly developed a reputation as perhaps the most feared sprinter in the world, and Abdu-Japarov is on the left of our picture as they come towards the line now. Leading out with Olaf Ludwig, the Olympic champion, in the centre of the picture, Abdu-Japarov suddenly takes a dive for the barriers and revolves right into the head of the pack. He takes down 2 Chateau d'Ax Gatorade riders, one of them was Jan Schur, and it really was a most horrific crash. Being mown down at almost 60 kilometres an hour by some of the fastest finishers in the world. And so, as a result of that, Dmitry Konishev, another Soviet rider, won his 2nd stage of this year's Tour de France and his 3rd in all. Abdu-Japarov, to claim his green jersey in this year's Tour de France, was helped over the finishing line, but he had a broken collarbone and severe concussion. And the winner of the Tour de France, Miguel Indurain, he avoided that very serious-looking crash at the finish on the very last day. 101 hours in the saddle for the Spaniard, only the 4th Spanish rider to win the Tour de France. He beat Gianni Bugno by 3 minutes 36 seconds. Claudio Chiappucci was 3rd, Charlie Motte was 4th, and Luc Leblanc was 5th. Of the others, Laurent Fignon finished in 6th place, 11 minutes and 27 seconds back. Greg LeMond finished 7th, but 13 minutes and 13 seconds down. How unlucky can you be? In 8th place was Andy Hampsten, 9th Pedro Delgado, and 10th Gerard Rouet. The King of the Mountains this year, Claudio Chiappucci. Last year he was a surprise when he finished 2nd. This year he's finished 3rd. What a great return to the Tour, and also won the King of the Mountains by 312 points ahead of Thierry Clavarola's 277. So this has been quite a different Tour de France, and Miguel Indurain, a very just winner indeed. He knew when to attack, and he attacked so well when it mattered. Greg LeMond, I feel, will come back. Greg LeMond this year showed to everybody he is not just a winner, he's a rider of great courage. So I hope you enjoyed this video of the 1991 Tour de France, and until the next time, goodbye.